Was NYC really as sleazy, dirty, and frankly, scary in the 70s as depicted in movies? 99% Invisible recently did an episode on this, as it relates to Times Square specifically. https:/99%invisible.org episode 608 New Year New Neighborhood Times Square was nicknamed the sleaziest block in America. Yes, I went to Times Square in the evening in '78. A cop said we should leave and waited until a cab picked us up, two 22-year-old females. It was filthy and run down, many creepy men, very scary. I visited as a kid in the mid-1970s. We stayed in a nice neighborhood in Manhattan in hotel expensive enough to make my parents cry, and even there every night the sex workers started appearing everywhere about 5 p.m. And yes, the city was gray, ugly, the buildings were all streaked with black crap, and with trash everywhere except Wall Street and Park Avenue, and we didn't even go into Central Park. Frankly, I thought New York was the worst place on earth. It was ugly, trashy, and felt dangerous. Yes, it was really that shitty scary. And you definitely did not go to TS at night or even during the day. Alphabet City was completely different too. I couldn't believe the gentrification that has happened there. Watch Annie Hall for some balance. But it did feel grittier when my parents would bring us in from the suburbs to see a show or a museum, compared to how it does now. I live in NYC. Speaking of another Annie, I was just reading about the original Broadway Annie, Andrea McArdle, who talks about being in the show which opened in 1977 and how she and the other orphans would roller skate around the outside of a house of prostitution a couple blocks from the Alvin Theater, now the Neil Simon, where the MJ musical is playing. Then these underage girls would be escorted to Studio 54 where they would be welcomed and given star treatment. Annie was a massive hit. Andrea was nominated for a Tony, and the show won for Best Musical, while adults around them were partying and being wild, and Andrea had her first drink there at 13. Yes, I remember the squeegee men washing our car when we got off the bridge into Washington Heights. Early 80s. Yes, entire parts of the city were destroyed or I lived. Tons of crime and gangs. NYC was losing population rapidly. Then they took lead out of gasoline sometime in the late 70s and people weren't so aggressive. Also, most of the city got gentrified for the next few decades. Up until the late 90s, if you went to a Broadway show, you had to walk past countless adult stores and live sex show theaters. I hate to say it, but Rudy Giuliani really turned the city around before he lost his brain after his terms in office. Yes, you did not want to be in Times Square at night. Check out The Deuce. I thinks it's pretty accurate. I went to New York City in the 90s, and it was like this. Then went back a few years later, and it was totally changed, all cleaned up, lots of the sex shops disappeared, etc., like a whole different city. Who remembers the garbage truck strike of the 1970s? Garbage piled 8 feet high in the streets. Times Square was filthy, lots of pawn shops and cheap jewelry shops. Only diners and bars that served beer or Jack and Coke. Penn Station filled with drug addicts, needles on the counters and floors in the bathrooms. Yeah, it was pretty bad back then. Jack Lemmon's The Out-of-Towners really gives the vibe. Even up to the late 1980s and early 1990s. In 1975, NYC was on the precipice of bankruptcy, saved by massive bond purchases by the labor union's pension funds. Other big cities, like LA and Chicago, were financially sound. I grew up in New York in the 80s in a fairly affluent enclave patrolled by private security from a nearby fancy university. The sound of gunshots in the not very great distance was so common that we didn't react to them. There were lots of posted warnings not to go into parks after dark. It was dangerous and run down. There were always places that were relatively safe because they were rich. And it's not like you'd see dead bodies every day, but crack vials littered the playgrounds and sketchy people were literally everywhere. Movies and TV are always exaggerations. Even at its absolute worst, your chances of getting murdered were extremely low, though your chances of getting mugged or having your car radio stolen were pretty high. But the depictions were definitely based in reality. To understand the difference, at its peak in 1990, the murder rate was something like 4 to 5 times higher than it was this year. And the 80s? Yes, my family lived in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Even when I was a kid in the 90s, NYC was way dirtier and run down. I frequently remember being reminded to step over the blood puddles near my aunt's apartment in Chelsea. It was like that up until Disney came into Broadway and started to clean the place up around 1992. The first time we went to the city as young teens around 1990, we were on 42nd and someone told us we needed to buy drugs or move on. Born 1970, New York. There was a ton of gang violence and graffiti. My dad got mugged a lot. Wasn't allowed to take the subway by myself until '82. You wouldn't go in any park after dark. parents put us in private school after 6th grade because public upper schools were dangerous. Times Square, including the area towards Penn Station, were disgustingly foul, full of XXX theaters and live peep shows. Prostitution was everywhere instead of online. Yet we survived.